Very much again for joining us. And now to introduce our guest for this evening. Sir John Redwood is a British politician and academic who was the Conservative MP for Wokingham from 1987 to 2004. I got to know him quite well in my previous role at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And even though he didn't know me, I knew him long before then because I was brought up in Wokingham. So John was my MP for a considerable period of time. During that time in Parliament, he served in the cabinet, but also in the shadow cabinets of John Major, William Hague, Michael Howard, and then has become one of the leading prominent backbenchers for the Conservatives, and I think it's fair to say a public intellectual on the Conservative side. Prior to his time in Parliament, however, he was a chief policy advisor to Margaret Thatcher, a businessman by background, but a pioneer of the Thatcher Revolution. He runs a regular blog, which we'll link to in the chat. If you're not aware of it, johnredwoodsdiary.com is must reading for people of our approach and our point of view. And he's also written quite a large number of books. A couple of the topics that I'm going to focus on are around the themes of his books. Usually I find that books written by politicians don't age particularly well, but John's were not only, I think, pertinent at the time, but appear to actually be even more pertinent some years after they've been written. Variously, he published in 1999, The Death of Britain, where he looks at the constitutional crises facing Britain via reforms implemented by the then Blair government. Singing the Blues, 30 Years of Tory Civil War, that was published in 2004, and I think probably remains as pertinent today. The coming conflict between the USA and the European Union, 2001, but I think worth another look today in 2024. And a few years ago, I haven't reread it in the last few days, but I read it when it came out. We Don't Believe You, Why Populists and the Establishment See the World Differently. And again, in the chat, we've given you the Amazon links to those books. If you're still doing some Christmas shopping, I commend them to you. That's enough from me. Sir John, thank you very much for joining us. What a pleasure to have you in this pop conversation. How are you doing?
Mark, well, a big thank you to you and your movement for all you are doing. I spent my life in and out of Parliament campaigning for wider ownership, for lower taxes, for honest money, for more prosperity, for giving people more freedoms so that they can achieve at their best. And you and your movement are an important force for it. Thank you also to all those sparing us an hour of their time this evening. Many are also doughty campaigners, and we can all do our bit. We can all get access to some media, we can campaign locally, we can help national figures, we can campaign nationally in some cases. And it's very important that we spread the message, because this country now is facing a crisis with this new government, reinforcing the worst things that the old government was doing and scrapping some of the things the other government was doing that were quite sensible. So we see a very socialist state descending on us. And I think this now is a government of the public sector, by the public sector, for the public sector. And it's going to squeeze the much bigger and very vital private sector and make it more difficult for people who want to run their own businesses, grow a small company, who wish to invest their savings, who wish to own some property, and particularly making it difficult for small businesses like farmers with their latest tax attack. So I think there's plenty to talk about tonight. I'm full of energy, wanting to make a big contribution to those forces inside and outside Parliament that are going to change the national conversation, offer people some hope where the government offers despair, offer people some freedom where the government is only offering restriction and bad regulation.
Well, John, thank you. Yes, and you're obviously a key ally of the PopCon movement in this regard. And well, let's kick off with some of these ideas. And I want to start with a bit of a sort of 30,000 feet view. Pick up some of the themes in your book, Why We Don't Believe You, Why Populists and the Establishment See the World Differently. I think it was about 5 years ago that came out. And you note the rise of populist parties from around the world. And you sort of point out that a rigid and unhappy elite just keeps shouting back at the electorate the same things that people don't really want to hear and don't want to listen to. Could you explore a bit and talk us through, has this actually worsened in the last 5 years? It seems to me that the preoccupations of the political elite are enormously different to the preoccupations of electorates in much of the Western world, and probably particularly in the UK at the moment. The sort of thing that the average voter is worried about doesn't really appear to register on the radar of the Labour government, but almost in the Palace of Westminster more generally. Has the disconnect ever been this bad?
I think the disconnect is bad and has got worse in recent years. I mean, I was writing particularly about the European problems because I noted that as early as the time when I read the book, a number of the great parties of the European Union states of the previous century was simply swept away. Christian Democrats, Social Democrats used to alternate in power, just as Labour and Conservative used to alternate in power in the United Kingdom, to a greater extent still does. But on the continent of Europe, partly with the PR system and partly, I think, because the elites had a much bigger stranglehold over what their governments could do because they were in the euro as well as all the EU rules, there were growing consternations by electors. So we saw it first of all in Greece, where Syriza came along as a challenger party and swept aside the traditional governing parties, and then unfortunately didn't see it through. And it too got swept aside because it didn't deliver the change that was promised. And then we saw National Rally emerge as a much stronger force in France. We see the AfD emerging as a much stronger force in Germany, probably in a strong second place going into their February general election. But we've also seen it spread to the United States of America. In America, there was the same frustration with what the establishment was doing, but instead of it sweeping aside either or both of the main parties, the Republican Party reformed from within, and it adopted a lot of the more radical agenda of the challenger parties elsewhere, and produced the Trump phenomenon, where we've now had 2 4-year terms won by Trump against all the odds, despite the establishment, strongly represented by the Democrat opponents, even trying to stop him running. Because one of the techniques that establishments use in Europe and in America is they try and use lawfare against populist candidates. And if the populist candidate said something wrong or had some behavioral mistake in their past, this is thought to be a reason why all their ideas and all their support should be invalidated and they shouldn't be allowed to challenge at the ballot box. So we're seeing a very strong struggle. What does the establishment believe? Well, they believe that central banks and austerity economics and anti-growth economics is the best you can do. They are strongly behind net zero, and they are allowing net zero policies to mean the deindustrialization of the advanced countries that follow them, but not the reduction of CO2 worldwide, because it turns out to be a let's import everything model. Absolutely crazy policy. And that is why the public gets so frustrated. They say, you have these big ideas about austerity and net zero. We want to be more prosperous. We want a better paid job. We want a job at all. We don't think the economy is growing fast enough. We'd like to own a home. The mortgages are too dear. And it's those bread and butter issues which the great parties on the continent and the Democrats more recently in America fail to grapple with sufficiently. So then they are swept aside by challengers.
This is fascinating, isn't it? And I was interested in you comparing and contrasting the American situation, where the Republican Party's still there, same name, same logo, but I would suggest, I mean, almost unrecognizable from the Republican Party of the George Bushes and the Mitt Romneys and the John McCain. So they've adapted in much of West. I think you might make the same point of the Canadian Conservatives as well, who look set to, fingers crossed, to win their federal elections. But in much of Europe, you've seen the traditional establishment legacy centre-right parties, the French Gaullists, the Italian Christian Democrats, to some degree the German Christian Democrats, melt away. Here in the UK, we appear to be between those two stools, right? So you've seen the Conservative Party get an absolute shellacking on July the 4th with what basically its worst results since democracy began, and the surge of Reform UK, a potential insurgent party that could bears the same hallmarks of those that have replaced legacy centre-right parties on the continent. But nevertheless, the Conservatives are still the formal opposition, came a clear second in vote share despite the woeful outcome on July the 4th. How do you see it playing out here? Will the Conservatives tilt in that direction, Or if they don't, will we find that Reform UK breaks through like the Labour Party did 100 years ago to replace the Liberals?
I think the Conservatives are evolving in the way the public would want, the Conservative half of the public. The new leader obviously understands that what went wrong for the Conservatives in the general election, it was not that Labour did well. Labour got a very small share of the popular vote for a winning party. But the Conservatives did particularly badly, and roughly half the Conservative vote of 2019 was not prepared to go back and vote again for the Conservatives. And that roughly split half and half between people who said, don't like what the Conservatives are doing, hate the Labour Party, I'm going to stay at home. And the other half who said, well, I'm going to give this new idea of reform a try. I know they can't win, but it will make a point. It will show the Conservatives that's where I would like them to be taking policy. So I think the next year or so is going to be a gripping drama on the Conservative side, because there's a real debate going on about the ideas that constitute sensible Conservative policy and how far you should go and how you can reconnect with the electorate. And there's going to be a competition between Reform, completely new, able to say what they like because they don't have a history in government, and the Conservative Party, with the advantages of being the established party, quite a lot of advantages under the first past the post system built into that, who have the opportunity to say, yes, we made mistakes. No, we didn't do enough to connect with the issues that really matter to you. Yes, we accepted too much establishment advice over COVID and over net zero and so forth, and then move on and show that they've learned the lesson. So it's going to be a gripping period.
That's fascinating. How easy do you think it will be? Is it just a matter of time before the Conservative Party, our party, can overcome the sort of, well, I was going to say disappointment, but in some cases, raw anger that a good chunk of the electorate feel for us not actually implementing Conservative policies? Migration as well being a standout example of endless continual pledges in successive manifestos about reducing it to tens of thousands and utterly failing to do so. Is time the greatest healer here, or does Kemi Badenoch and other leading Conservatives need to do some sort of grand mea culpa, or might just the disappointment, the anger, the resentment fade as the coming weeks, months and year or two pass?
I don't think just letting time pass solves the problem at all, because people have the attitudes they have. And although the anger against the Tories will fade and the anger against Labour will grow because Labour is doing the bad things that the previous government was doing on steroids and cancelling some of the good things that the previous government was doing. So on the Conservative half of the country, they're obviously much less preferred than the Conservatives. But what I think can happen could happen quite quickly, is that the new Conservative team can show real conviction as well as a bit of contrition and say, yes, we've learned from mistakes, or we learned that some of the things we were doing we didn't do enough of and we should reinforce. And the more they say that and repeat it and show they really mean it, that helps move the case for conservatism on through the Conservative Party. And they've also got to be a very effective opposition against Labour. Difficult to win any votes because of the huge imbalance in Parliament, but you can win lots of arguments and you can create popular pressures for change of policy. This looks to me like quite a wobbly Prime Minister and top team, not very experienced, not very sure, don't really have much by way of ideological underpinning in the case of some of them. And so why couldn't effective opposition make a difference? And the more you make a difference, you reverse policies or get them to change their minds, the more will people will say, well, you know what, I wouldn't mind having a bit of that in government.
Yeah. Have you been surprised about how utterly dismal this government's been? I mean, I expected them to do a lot of bad things, but I expected them to execute those bad things with a certain degree of competence. And I'm not sure they've even managed that. Did you anticipate this being as bad for Labour? And I mean, they've collapsed in the opinion polls, but you're right, they're showing no sign really of confidence or being in charge. They don't appear to have spent any of their 14 years in opposition working out what their game plan would be for their first 100 days or first year in office. I'm astonished. I knew I'd hate their policy programme, but I didn't realise they would be flailing around quite this badly.
I've been very surprised at how bad they are. I thought the one thing they would be very good at is spin and messaging, because I thought they'd taken advice from Mandelson and Blair, and they were certainly very good at all of that. But they have been so maladroit. I mean, the only messaging they've wanted to put out is everything in the country is rubbish, and it's all the fault of the previous government. And the longer you're in government, the more you have to say things are getting better because you are responsible for them all. And you, on the first week, you can say this is all wrong, and but you've got to say I'm going to fix it. When you get to month 4, month 5, month 6, people are saying, well, you told us it was rubbish a long time ago. What have you done about it? Why isn't it getting better? If it's so easy to fix it, why didn't you fix it? So the messaging has been wrong. And then I don't think they prepared themselves for governing, even though they had the advice of Sue Gray and other senior people who worked inside the centre of government very closely with the previous government. And so they get into office and they're still like opposition politicians with a majority. So they make a statement. We're going to crack down on the small boat trade. Lovely. How? When? Oh, no, we're cracking down on it. And look, the numbers have gone up. Oh, yes, but that's an annoying inconvenience. We are actually dealing with it. No, you're not. You've got to deal with it. You are responsible for the problem. You have to deal with the problem.
Yeah, I think one of my favourites was, I don't put any store by this mystical £22 billion black hole in the public finances that they've suddenly discovered. But of course, it was just a few days ago that Ed Miliband then announces a £22 billion carbon capture scheme.
Yes.
Where there is a £22 billion black hole, I've got an idea how you might be able to fill that black hole. Almost to the penny. Look, John, I want to move on a bit to the institutions of the UK, because we set up popular conservatism really, although it was in February of this year, so before the general election, to try and work out why, frankly, over 14 years of Conservative government, we had not made the progress that Conservatives would want. In fact, it's quite difficult to find any aspect in which we have left the country in a more conservative place than we found it way back in 2010. So we turned our attention to this problem. And although you might be able to criticise, I don't know, the lack of political will or the judgment or the competence of, or the direction of travel of any or all of the 5 Conservative prime ministers who served in that time, our view was that, unfortunately, we've allowed to grow up an institutional infrastructure, largely but not entirely inherited from Tony Blair, that tilts the pitch, that makes it harder to achieve Conservative ends, that the system is geared to more regulation, more government spending as the answer to every problem, geared against liberalising markets and reducing taxes. Do you basically buy that analysis? I mean, do you think that's the reason that if you, I mean, I think if a Martian had just taken a snapshot of Britain in 2020 and a snapshot of Britain in 2024, he would have assumed the left had been in charge for 14 years, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I agree that many ministers were too cautious and there was a leftwards drift. I think it began because in the early years, of course, they were in alliance with the Liberal Democrats. So they were under pressure to keep the coalition together. So there was an obvious drift to Lib Dem, left wing, and often bad policies. And I think it became a habit of mind in some ministers once we got a majority. But I think the real problems that hit the government hit after 2019. After all, Boris came in, promised to get Brexit done, promised to run a more conservative operation, got a very good majority in 2019. And so what went wrong actually went wrong 2020 to 2024. And I think it was the devastating impact that the response to COVID had upon our economy and society. I think they did too much and it did a lot of damage, both economically and socially. I was one of that minority of MPs who wanted less lockdown for fewer people and wanted much more concentration on protecting the vulnerable and a bit more freedom for those who weren't vulnerable. And I think it was the debauching of the money and the currency by the Bank of England's quantitative easing policies and the massive bond buying and the suppression of any kind of interest rate yield for quite a long time that caused the inflation, which was the last straw with the public. They thought Conservatives normally know how to run the money and they can't even control the inflation. And although many people didn't ascribe it, as I do, mainly to the Bank of England, they said, well, government's to blame for everything by definition in a democracy, because government has the power to change things. They can change institutions, they can change personnel, they can change policies. They didn't. The policy was inflationary, so we don't like it.
This is fascinating. And obviously the Bank of England, just before we came on air, John, you were saying this has been your bête noire now for some time. Talk us through what's gone wrong here and how much of it has just been, if you like, bad decision-making by the governor, or how much of it, again, is endemic in the structure that the bank is not sufficiently accountable for sake of argument. I mean, it seemed to me on the face of it, and I'm a monetarist by philosophy, but not by expertise, but that if you miss your inflation target, you know, you've got one job. And if you keep missing that target, at some point, rather than just printing off yet another letter of apology to the Chancellor, you should lose your job. But that doesn't appear to happen to anybody at the Bank of England. What decisions have been made that have been bad? And can you and I know that you also think we've got this problem with the bonds. Can you spell that out for our audience in sort of intelligent layman's terms? And what would you structurally change about the Bank of England going forward? Would you end its independence, for example?
I've been trying to explain to people for the last 5 years that the Bank of England is not independent. It is wholly owned by the state. It's an integral part of state finances. It works very closely with the Treasury. The independence it was granted under Gordon Brown was the independence to settle the short-term interest rate, the bank rate, and to do that through partially transparent structure of having experts on the Monetary Policy Committee, bank insiders and few outsiders who review economic forecasts and decide what is the appropriate level of overnight or short-term interest rates. And that is an independent power which I've never challenged. I don't think they use it very well. And in order for them to use it better, they need to have different types of economists around the table. They shouldn't all have broadly the same views, because their models don't work and their forecasting of inflation was woefully inadequate over the last 5 years. And if they can't forecast inflation, they can't set the right interest rates. So we've just seen that proven. So keep that bit of independence, but you need to change the people and get them to come up with better inflation models. And their model of the economy should be back tested, because we know their model of the economy got their inflation hopelessly wrong in the first 5 years of this decade, because it was saying 2% inflation 2 years out when the inflation went to 11%. So it is wildly wrong. There's then the much broader bits of the bank that have never been independent. And indeed, they are less independent today than a few years ago, because when they invented the idea that the bank can create lots of money in its own accounts and go out and buy bonds from people in order to drive the bond price up, which drives the long-term rate of interest down, that was always a joint control policy. Every pound of quantitative easing money created and spent on buying bonds was signed off by Chancellors of the Exchequer on behalf of Parliament and the government. So it started with Alistair Darling and went through to Rishi Sunak, and Rishi was asked to sign off 450 billion of money printing and bond buying, which he did, because I think he did feel he should follow the bank advice. I think the bank advice was very bad, because I think the third tranche of that, when we were clearly coming into recovery after the COVID lockdown started to relax, the extra 150 billion was bound to be inflationary. And so we saw an inflation in assets, first of all. That was the idea of the thing. They wanted to inflate bond prices and therefore share and property prices. And then, of course, it spilled out because some of the people selling bonds and shares from property at elevated prices then did more spending. And so you had a more general inflation. I'm afraid this is a pattern of conduct I've seen from the bank over all too many years while I've been following these affairs. Right back in the 70s, you had competition and credit control, which created a money boom and a secondary banking and property crisis. And then you had the ERM disaster, where the bank and the establishment recommended this very destabilizing approach to monetary policy, where we had a boom which created an inflation, which then created a cruel bust with dramatic events in the markets, which led to the collapse of that particular Conservative government. And then we saw something similar hitting Labour, although they did quite a lot to encourage it themselves over the first decade of this century, when you had a boom when we were told by these advisors that there were new ways of managing risk and people could just borrow a lot more money than they ever did before and they could gear everything to the eyeballs. And that didn't work. So we then had a bust in the great banking crash. And then more recently, we've had the great COVID inflation, where the bank made the same mistakes as the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve Board in America. But as proof that they didn't have to, the Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China, and the Swiss Central Bank did not do what the three Western banks did. And their inflation stayed around 2%, undermining the argument that the inflation was caused by Ukraine.
Yeah. So looking back as well, you've mentioned some of the failures there. I'll seed in some of the questions from our audience. There's more than 24 of them now in the chat box. I'll try and get in the Q&A box. I'll try and get through as many as possible. Christopher Marshall asks, does Sir John think that the financial difficulties of the Truss administration had anything to do with the actions of the central bank? And just as an addendum to that, I believe the Bank of England looked into themselves, published a report on their own website in which they thought the market instability was 2/3 their fault. Well, if they're admitting it's 2/3 their fault, it's likely at least 2/3 their fault. They're unlikely to round that up. Tell us a bit about what you think happened there. And again, does that sort of show the unaccountability of the bank and sort of it wasn't working in tandem with the Truss administration's policy, right? So you had the bank pushing in one direction and the government in the other. That seems to me particularly problematic. And again, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss paid with their political careers when their administration failed. Nobody at the bank seems to have paid with their career.
No, very good points. And by way of background, I mean, I did present my thoughts on what kind of budget Liz and Kwasi could do. And the budget I presented to them had considerably less borrowing and less public spending than they had in their mixture. I did have a good lot of tax reductions, but a much tighter budget deficit. And I think it was a mistake that they overdid the spending and the budget deficit in their budget. But I don't think that was the main reason the markets responded as they did in the way you started to describe. The events were extraordinary, weren't they? Because just before this growth budget, which the bank could read in the papers was going to be a growth budget, and Kwasi was saying that he was talking regularly to the governor of the Bank of England, as he was quite entitled to do. Just before the budget, the Bank of England chooses that moment to put up interest rates, to threaten rather more interest rate rises to come, and decides to sell £80 billion worth of bonds in the market to drive the prices of the bonds down. That's the point of the sales program, just as the point of their massive buying program had been to drive the prices of the bonds up to get lower long-term interest rates. So the bank was targeting higher mortgages in the statements it made just before the growth budget. So the markets fell on that. The Americans were doing something similar, so the markets fell on that. Then there was a bit more of a fall because the budget deficit was rather high on the Kwarteng budget. But then the Monday collapse the following week, the biggest collapse, was all to do with these liability-driven investment funds, all very techy. But that was a failure of Bank of England understanding and regulation. They were meant to regulate this. The pension funds had all gone off, or most of them, and bought far more bonds, far more British government bonds than they can afford, and they'd done it on a leveraged investment idea. And so as soon as the bond prices started falling under the weight of Bank of England selling and the general mood, these positions were uncovered, and they had to stump up a whole load of extra cash because the values of the bonds that they held and couldn't afford were going down. And we even got to the position where pension funds were having to sell bonds to pay the bills on the other bonds that they couldn't afford to own. Yeah. And so the market was in complete meltdown. All the natural buyers are gone. The Bank of England had gone from being one of the biggest buyers to being one of the biggest sellers. The pension funds could no longer afford to buy. They were selling bonds. Everybody else looking at it said, well, as it's all sales, I'm not going to buy bonds today. Let's see how far these things fall. And we know that it was mainly the Bank of England because then the Bank of England stepped into the market and did a complete flip-flop and said, you know what, this has gone too far. We're going to start buying bonds again. As soon as they did that, the markets flipped up again and the crisis resolved.
Really interesting. And it just does seem to me that, accountability just seems disproportionately to fall on the hands of elected politicians and never on the hands of our bureaucracy. Thinking more widely about the institutions, Stephen McLean points out, I don't know if this is breaking news, here's a curiosity, Mark Carney is rumoured to be joining the Trudeau administration this week. Well, God help Canada, I would say to that, I think. But on the wider sort of institutional infrastructure, I know the bank's an area that you focused on particularly. What do you make of the civil service? David Noblet asks, Sir John, Dominic Cummings, I know he's not everybody's cup of tea, recently stated that the civil service needs restructuring. What changes would you like to see with the civil service? Now, often on our side of the ledger, I think, some people sort of say it's impossible to get through the civil service. They're all sort of, BBC style lefties. In fact, a former cabinet minister in the last government came up with a great phrase. I don't think he said it publicly, so I shouldn't name him. That the civil service response to him, he described as consent and evade. So he would give an instruction saying, I want this cancelled or done by Friday. Oh, yes, Minister. Yes, Minister, we'll certainly look into that. And then they'd come back and say, well, there's a legal problem here. It's a cross-departmental agreement there. There's an international arrangement somewhere else. How much of a barrier to reform do you think the civil service is? Or is it just that politicians are just too limp-wristed, don't show enough of a spine just to drive through their agenda? I was speaking to a former Labour minister on GB News a couple of weeks ago who sort of said, well, if the minister's determined enough, you can get it done. And I was a bit betwixt and between there because, well, fair enough, but I'm not sure I want our ministers to need to be sort of super determined and to work out the Machiavellian way to get round the civil service. I want the civil service to carry out the minister's instructions. What are your thoughts on how good or bad the civil service is and what, if anything, should be done about it?
Well, when I helped Margaret Thatcher as her head of policy, I was a civil servant, and I found a small cadre of intelligent, energetic, very interesting civil servants that we could work with, and quite often we had to set up a special arrangement and make sure that the machinery of government was going to work for the policies we wanted to put through. But then that did work. For example, privatization was one of the big things I took to Margaret Thatcher. And the reason she invited me in was she said, I'm now ready for this. You, John, can help me. I've listened and followed things you've been saying over the years, and I'm now ready to do this. And so the advice she followed was to set up a unit in the Treasury under a dedicated minister, and he handpicked some extremely good officials who were motivated and saw the idea. And whilst the rest of Whitehall was still very reluctant, they thought it was a power loss and a loss of assets they didn't wish to lose. And they thought that some of these industries would not work at all well in the private sector. There was a team of people there that would help us deliver the policy, and we did deliver it to time on quite a big scale. So I think it can be done. So what reforms do I want to see? Well, first of all, the civil service is far too big. And one of the things that's happened compared with Thatcher's days is that there are many more senior officials, many more officials being promoted in order to get around pay difficulties. And you've got a very top-heavy civil service. Cabinet office is way overloaded with people. And number 10 has been too big. I mean, the number 10, where I helped Margaret Thatcher, there are only 3 of us senior officials to help deliver her will. I did policy, and Bernard did handling the media and communications, and her principal private secretary did cabinet and delivery of government mechanisms, and that was enough. We could do that, and we could be effective because we saw the Prime Minister a lot. We could have quite a lot of private arguments and discussions with her to sort things out with her, and then we would come out of the room, nobody would know what had gone on. The Prime Minister wishes this, and Whitehall knew that if we said this is what the Prime Minister wants, it is what the Prime Minister wanted, because she just agreed it with us or instructed us. As soon as you get 20, 30, 40, 50 people who are all claiming to know the Prime Minister's view, you get big disagreements of view, you get muddle, and of course quite a lot of them don't know what the Prime Minister's view is. And indeed I've heard senior officials in the last few years tell me what the Prime Minister's view is. And having had a quick word with the Prime Minister, I know that he hasn't even made up his mind on it. And you think, well, this is a work of fiction, so why should Whitehall take this very seriously? So I think fewer people, you need a few really trusted people if you're going to be a successful cabinet minister or a successful Prime Minister. There needs to be some continuity, and then a slimmed down civil service that can help deliver. And if the civil service itself is struggling to do the administrative tasks or to implement the policies, then you need contracting out. And so you say to the civil service, simple choice here. I'd love to trust my own staff here. You should be cheaper, better, faster. Show me how you're going to do it. But if you don't think you can do it, or if you look dearer, slower, worse, then I'm going to go to a contracted out answer.
Oh, that's interesting. So, I mean, I've always wondered whether we messed up the system a bit by having these sort of special advisors, political appointees, who seem to be more on the kind of media side with a certain degree of policy briefing. I wonder whether we just bite the bullet and say those in a senior position, I don't know how far you take it down to, maybe director level, should be political appointments of the minister or of the government. Obviously, you know, Barry in accounts doesn't need to be a political appointee, or the window cleaner, or the tea lady, or whatever, or the filing clerk. Would you go that far to say that the permanent secretary, the director generals, the directors, should they just stand or fall with the administration? And if you're the new Secretary of State for X, you decide who you're bringing in, and just like in the USA, you know, if you fall or the administration falls, they fall with you.
I think there's a case for looking at the USA system. I used to think not, but I share the frustrations of you and others that the failure of government departments to implement wishes, clearly expressed wishes of ministers. So there may be a case for doing that, but I don't give up on the current system. I've just been beginning to sketch some of the ideas, but I think fewer, better, stronger lines of communication between secretaries of state, prime ministers, and their senior officials, and more tasking. And I think I would introduce more flexible remuneration with a bigger bonus element related to achievement of clearly measured and stated goals. We're full of statistics and full of far too many targets in government. But I think there is a role for one or two key targets where you've got something you desperately want to drive. I mean, for example, migration, where the outgoing Conservative government at the start of this year got round to realizing that legal migration was far too high and started to make some serious changes. They should have done more earlier. But when you've got a policy like that, then you should say to your senior officials, we really mean this, and we want to reduce it by however many. So give us the policies that do so, and why shouldn't you benefit from some of the success if we achieve it? Or in the case of the Governor of the Bank of England, I'm taking a positive line, you were taking a more negative line, and we want you to keep inflation around 2%. You can have a big salary if you keep it around 2%, but the more it goes up, the less we're going to pay you. We'll pay you a basic salary so that you can pay the food and lodging costs. But if you want the extra frills of 500, 600,000 a year, you're going to have to earn that by actually delivering the inflation forecast.
Yeah, lovely. I've always liked Art Laffer's view that legislators should be similarly incentivized, that, you know, MPs' salaries should be attached, I don't know, to a mixture of the growth rate and whether the state of the public finances and whether a balanced budget has been delivered. I'm not.
Well, that's quite cruel, because the typical backbencher doesn't get much control over how they do the growth rate. I mean, how would you pay someone who'd always had good ideas on the growth rate and had always been ignored?
No, I suppose that's right, but it might encourage legislators to push harder for good ideas, I guess, even if it's not an entirely fair way of doing it. John, I want to look over to the other side of the pond. I mentioned at the top of the show that nearly a quarter of a century ago, in 2001, you wrote Stars and Strife, the common conflict between the USA and the European Union. If you were to update that for 2024 or 2025, what do you make of the incoming Trump administration? And do you think there will be conflict between the European Union and the United States of America? Are we now locked into, potentially, I don't know exactly what Trump will do, of course, but are we now locked into two very different models, that the USA is likely to bear down on public expenditure, to deregulate, to be highly skeptical about colossally expensive carbon net zero schemes, whereas the EU seemed by and large, not universally, but by and large, more locked into a social democratic, Butskillite, spend and regulate model. How do you see that panning out? Do you think we'll start to see the stark differences between those two, or am I being rather over-optimistic about what to expect from President Trump's second tour of duty?
Well, I meant by conflict, diplomatic disagreements, trade wars, big policy disagreements, different approach to world problems. I didn't mean hot war. And that's still my view today. And I would say that what's about to happen is an intensification of what I was writing about some years ago now, because I think you've identified some of the main flare points. And the most obvious one, which we saw in the first Trump presidency, was calling many European countries out for free riding on American defense. And I think Trump is right about that. And if you want common defense where America is going to produce the lion's share of the defense because of her relative wealth and sophistication of her weaponry, very least the European countries should do who need the security guarantee is to make their own minimum 2% contribution according to the rules of the club. And I think that amount has to go up, and I think Trump will lead that debate. But I think also Trump is going to lead the debate to say that quite a lot of these security issues are now very linked to Europe and to war in Europe, which we've had too much of in the last 20 years and have a bad dose of in Ukraine at the moment, that Europe has to make a bigger physical contribution as well as a bigger financial contribution. Because why shouldn't Europe recruit soldiers for policing or peacemaking duties or whatever is needed rather than relying on American personnel? And then I think on trade, Trump will call Europe, the EU, out rather more because he feels that they have asymmetric approaches to trade where they protect themselves and blame other people if they attempt protection back. And America has a big deficit with them. And so he is going to probe that and try and demonstrate that some of their trading practices are unfair. And quite a lot of it rests in this area of regulation where grossly over-regulated economy, in the case of the EU, uses some of that regulation to keep out American products and to favor domestic products that had to be made to a specified recipe laid down in legislation. So I think there'll be a lot of tension on that. But there may well also be tension on how you approach Russia, how you deal with Iran, how you deal with the Middle East, how you deal with China. Because I think quite often leading countries on the continent of Europe are undermining the position vis-a-vis China or Russia by some of their economic and diplomatic actions behind the scenes at a time when America has been trying to lead the free world in robust pushback where Russia and China are behaving badly.
How much should we take at face value what President-elect Trump is saying about tariffs? I mean, I think both you and I are free traders. Sometimes I think you've got to apply game theory to trade deals, not just neoclassical economics. I'm completely persuaded that global free trade's the right way to go, or possibly even unilateral free trade. But actually, in a negotiation, you sometimes need to use these sticks, even if it's not your intention to impose the tariffs. But do you think we could see this? They're eye-watering, some of the numbers that Trump's coming up with. I mean, I must admit, I did rather like him referring to Prime Minister Trudeau as the governor of Canada, as if Canada was now officially the 51st state rather than prime minister. So I quite like his style there. But actually, in terms of economic, this could be pretty bad, couldn't it? I mean, if we get a trade war with China or between the EU and the USA, I'm very concerned, whilst I like his broad brush agenda, that when he starts saying that his favourite word in the dictionary is tariff, are we actually in for a nationalist protectionist government rather than a free trading, buccaneering, free market government in the States?
Well, you and me the same. I think the lower taxes are a great idea for America and the wider world economy. I think the deregulation will be very sensible. I think having more of your own domestic energy is a great policy, which will work very well for America. And rolling back the waste and excesses of the federal government will be very necessary for trying to get some sense into very bloated American budgets, because the tariffs are not good news. I think there are different types of tariff policy that he's proposing. I can live with the tariff threat policy, where he's saying to China, we want changes of conduct from you, and if we don't get it, we're going to have tariffs. I can understand him threatening Mexico with tariffs to say, you have got to make your contribution to policing this border, because we can't carry on with all these illegal migrants pouring into America all the time. The American public very clearly against that. So he is using that. And I don't think he wants to impose the very penal tariffs on Mexico. I think he wants Mexico to change its border policy, and let's hope they find a compromise. But then there's the more worrying thing where he says, well, why don't we have a general tariff on all imports into America because America imports too much? And of course, you and I know there are reasons why that isn't necessarily good for America, because he seems to think all of the tariff would be levied on the exporting country or company. Whereas in some cases, America is going to have to buy those products anyway, and so they can put the prices up. So it actually becomes a consumer tax on the American public. Now, we don't know how high it will go and what the balance would be between the American consumer tax element and the export country element. We do know that the world would be a bit worse off if we go for a lot of general tariffs. And I hope there will be more discussions. I'm not sure his Treasury Secretary is so wedded to general tariff approach as he is. I think one of the things that Trump likes about it is the thought that here's a big pool of potential revenue, which he could then use to lower other taxes. And so he would say, not so worried about the consumption tax element on Americans because I'm going to give it back to them as a tax rebate. And that's where he would abate the impact on America, but he doesn't abate the impact on the rest of us.
Yeah. My colleague Annunziata Rees-Mogg asks, what do you think, if imposed, Trump's tariffs on world trade, especially on China, would have on us here in the UK? What would be the knock-on or overspill effect? And then a couple of people have asked this. The Starmer government is talking about resetting and reframing our relationship with the EU. Should we be doing that? I mean, are we going to be perennially negotiating our relationship with the major economies just over the English Channel? Or is this, completely undoing Brexit, as some Brexiteers fear? So impact on the UK if Trump does go down this route, do we just watch from afar, or will it impact our economy? I think she means let's assume no tariffs on British goods for the sake of this thought experiment, just an international trade war. And what needs to be done to improve trade with the European Union from a UK perspective? Is Starmer onto something here, or is he just going down a rabbit hole?
I think Brexit is a great opportunity for us, and we've, on the whole, not taken advantage of the obvious freedoms to make sure we get all those benefits, but we're still benefiting a lot because we don't have to make these big financial contributions to them anymore. We're not part of their 800 billion borrowing bonanza, which we'd otherwise be liable for. But in this trade issue, this is exactly where the Brexit freedom should be used, and what Starmer and his team should be doing all the time is pressing on the new Trump administration as it forms to say, we are different from the EU. We don't want all their rules and regulations. We don't want to get caught up in a tariff war with you. We have a pretty good trade already with you. Why don't we have a free trade agreement? And I think Trump would be open for that, but it's got to be wholehearted. And it shouldn't be at the same time Starmer saying, because I love the EU more and I really want to be developing this close relationship. The reason why I think he's foolish to be doing what he's doing is that I do not think there is any likelihood of the EU granting us a better deal. They decided a long time ago that we weren't going to get a better deal. And in response to Starmer making some rather general noises about when to be lovely because we just get on better and then there'll be more trade, the EU has said, well, you first of all give us a load more fish in perpetuity. And you also agree to anybody under the age of 30 having special terms to come into your country that looks a bit like freedom of movement. And that is the most active group, most likely to take advantage at a time when we have so many people coming into our country. We're short of homes, we're short of healthcare, we're short of all kinds of public services. And this government is no better able to catch up with it than the last government did. So I think he will get a rebuff, and then all he can do is present a defeat as if it was some kind of triumph. But the whole thing is based on a complete myth. We have a free trade agreement with the EU already. There are no tariffs on any goods moving either way. And so what is it he's trying to achieve? The trade hasn't actually bombed in the way Remain and some of the traditional media say it did. Since 2016, our trade with the EU is up in cash terms and in real terms. Not as much as with the rest of the world, but it has grown. It always grew less fast than with the rest of the world when we're in the EU, so that hasn't really changed. So we should stop pretending there's been some trade disaster, and we should understand that the scope to improve the terms of this agreement are vanishingly small.
Looking again back over to America, I'm slightly shoehorning this one in, but I'd welcome your thoughts. I don't know a great deal about Argentina, but Peter Phillips asked, what can we learn from Javier Milei and his Argentinian experiment? Is it time for Kemi Badenoch to rev up the chainsaw above her head as her key campaigning slogan. I mean, it seems to have confounded a lot of the skeptics. I think inflation in Argentina has fallen from 25% to 2%-ish since he's taken office, and he seems to be still riding a wave of popularity, despite, or perhaps because of the massive reductions he's seeking to make in government spending. What, I mean, different country, different history and the rest of it. But what do you make of the Milei experiment, or project, I suppose, as it is now, rather than a mere experiment?
Well, the Argentinian situation was far more extreme than the UK situation, with hyperinflation and a massive budget deficit and inability to fund debt and regular state bankruptcies, which is very different from our experience here, I'm pleased to say. So he needed to use more extreme language and to take more extreme measures to try and get it into shape. And what he's done so far, as I understand it, is by reducing a lot of public spending, he's got the deficit under proper control for the first time for many, many years. And that has to be the starting point in controlling inflation and money and credit and getting a balance back into the economy. And we would expect inflation to come down quite a lot from here. That it's been a very bumpy ride because he inherited a very well set hyperinflation. Well, what do I take from it? Well, I take from it that when you look at the more moderate mistakes and circumstances of the UK or the EU, it proves the same point, that if you allow deficits to spiral out of control, your finances get wrecked. If you allow too much money to be printed, you can get extremely high inflation. And if you want to see it in its raw misery, you go to an extreme case like Argentina. So if we want to make sure we never are an extreme case like Argentina, that is why we need honest money. That is why we need reforms at the Bank of England in the way we conduct counter-inflation policy. And that is why we need a growth strategy in Britain, which
but we may be able
does
to
have tax reductions, but also has expenditure reductions so that there isn't an excessive deficit.
But it may be the case that the UK can use a scalpel rather than a chainsaw, perhaps.
Well, I think so, and I think there are more civilized ways of doing it when your position is not as extreme. So I don't think you go and sack a whole load of the civil service, but all I'm asking the government to do is to put a staff freeze on, so that every year you may reduce the civil service by 6 or 7% just because people have retired or moved elsewhere, and you promoted or moved sideways from within to fill the jobs you really need doing. And each time you've taken out jobs when people leave. That's a civilized way of doing it. The sooner we start doing that, the sooner we get our public accounts under better control.
Yeah. We've only got a few minutes to go. We might overrun by a few minutes. John's generously said he could spare us a few minutes of our time. I want to move to immigration, John. We've touched on it in this conversation somewhat. I don't know whether it's the top issue on people's minds, but it's consistently one of the most salient issues. And it does seem to me that the slice of the electorate who tick that box as their top concern, it really is their top concern. Numbers 2, 3, and 4 are some way behind. I still think the economy is probably overall number one. And you mentioned that we had failed to deliver on this. What do you think the Conservative policy and approach should now be? We might have to do this sort of mea culpa, or explain what we got wrong, but what framework should we be looking at, not just to stop the boats, which is the illegal migration point, but on the much higher legal migration point? And it seems to me, I mean, I've seen some eye-watering figures, but sort of suggest if every year nearly 1 million people are coming in, and generalization clacks an alert, but they tend to be at the lower end of the income spectrum, and generally speaking, net beneficiaries from the welfare system rather than net contributors in tax, combined with there's a danger of brain drain at the top end and flight, millionaires leaving the country. This is colossally unsustainable situation in the long run. Do we need to just sort of make entry into the country based on, well, you might have certain cultural things that you'd measure. You need to be in favour of free speech and not be on a terrorist watch list and the rest of it. But should we sort of say, look, the price of government in Britain, if you divide it between the population of the UK, is about £14,000 per person per year. Okay, that's a very blunt measurement because obviously elderly people cost more and kids cost more because they're in schools. But as a rough ready rule of thumb, £14,000 per person per year, that's the cost of a visa. If you want to come into the UK, you need to pay that amount. You can write it off against your income tax if you're a high earner. If you want to bring your wife and 2 kids, that's another £42,000 for them. Should we just have a clean way of dealing with it to ensure that we're bringing in net contributors? They needn't be workers, by the way. I mean, if a retired multimillionaire wants to move here because, I don't know, they like the scenery or the weather or whatever, fine by me, as long as they're paying their own way. Do you think that's, I'm sure I haven't got the policy detail worked out, but do you think that's roughly the right framework to think about the problem?
Well, I think the Conservatives have to be very honest that far too many people came in legally on their watch. They can make the perfectly good point that they realized at the beginning of this year, and they did make quite a big change to reduce the categories who were eligible. But they need to explain why it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because if you bring that number of people in, where are you suddenly going to find homes for 1 million people? Where are you suddenly going to find the extra doctors and hospital capacity for an extra 1 million people? Where are you going to find all the extra water supply and pipes for conducting water around the country for all that number of people? Where does all the extra broadband come from? All these things have a cost. And so whilst you've looked at the revenue costs, and I agree some of those need to be reflected in the scheme, I think you've got to look at the capital costs, and that is what the government and the Treasury refused to do. The official advice was lamentable on this. The Treasury was saying, if we invite in people, even those on very low incomes, and indeed quite a lot of them are on no incomes, GDP will grow because they earn a bit or they consume a bit and so forth. But GDP per head was actually falling. And at the same time, you had a very big capital crunch because you did not have all the money you needed to build them a flat or a house and to provide them with the surgeries and the hospitals and all of the utilities. Now, the EU, for once, did a rather good piece of work on this at the time of the big surge of migrants into Germany and the EU, 2015, 2016. And they said that a fair sum of money that should be paid to a member state receiving a new migrant would be 250,000 euros for all the setup costs. Because if you want a flat and you want all these public facilities and you may need to give them some benefit help in the early stages, that was their assessment. The other member states didn't disagree with the assessment, but they weren't very keen to pay it. But it was an attempt to get the member states who were ducking taking people to make a financial contribution to those who were not, who were taking. So I think that's a more realistic figure. And when you put that kind of figure into the balance, you realize that on financial grounds, none of this makes any sense at all. So what it means is that people coming in should be people with considerable wealth who wish to invest or spend here from money they've already made, or they should be people who are coming into well-paid jobs, so that then there's a clear advantage to the country. Obviously, there are other categories you allow. I mean, you want to allow students to come in, but coming in as a student to take advantage of good education in a British university shouldn't mean they then get a right to become a citizen or to stay on for many years.
Or that you can bring your mother with you, for example.
Or you bring the rest of the family, yes.
Yeah,
and I don't remember taking my family to university and I went to study there.
Let's finish on some advice that you might give to the Conservative Party under Kemi Badenoch, John. I think, but I was a Robert Jenrick supporter. I think you were too, but we are where we are. Kemi has won. She's been in office for a few weeks, probably too early to make any judgment. The opinion polls are not great for us. They're bad for Labour. And I guess if you told most Conservatives just after the general election that come December you'll be about neck and neck with the Labour Party, they would have ripped your arm off for that sort of electoral forecasting. But there are a range of questions in the chat. Perhaps I'll machine gun a few at you, but I really want to tease out your advice for where the Conservative Party should go from here. Martin Lejeune asks, how would John Redwood compare Thatcher with Badenoch? Have they actually got anything in common beyond their gender? Lashia Gurung, I hope I pronounced your name right. I haven't strangled it too badly. Good evening, all. We all know reform is ahead of us in some polls, and a lot of our members are defecting to reform. What would you do to stop this? Valerie Coker asked, should Kemi be focusing on reforming Conservative HQ? Have we actually, is the party just way out of date? Farage seems to be setting up some more sort of MAGA rally-based type party, whereas we might still be stuck somewhere in the 1960s or 70s in terms of our party structure. Martin Lejeune also asked, will the Tories be swept away by reform? And it seems to me, I'll add on to that my question, John, and then we can have your thoughts. Kemi has sort of said she doesn't want to commit to specific retail policies at this stage, that there's a long time before the next general election. You don't need to write the manifesto in 2024 if there's not going to be an election until 2029. And I sort of get that you otherwise you start making all these sort of commitments, and then people say this doesn't add up, there's a black hole here. But I also wonder whether there are certain commitments which aren't necessarily, if you like, policy commitments, they're more signposts. You could commit to leaving the ECHR and say, we'll get back to you about precisely how we'll draw up our immigration policy or what British Bill of Rights might replace the Human Rights Act. You could say carbon net zero by 2050 is going to be abandoned and say, but we'll take a good period of time until we come back to you with what our approach to decarbonisation would be. So I wonder whether she's taking this sort of grand vision thing a bit too literally, and we can at least, you know, have a few signposts on the way to the manifesto without having to, you know, begin writing it yet. But those are a few thoughts from me and our assembled audience. What's your advice to her after just over, what is it now, 6 weeks she's had as leader of the party?
Well, my advice to your audience and the party, first of all, is get behind Kemi. She won fair and square. She ran a good campaign. She won it by a convincing majority. The Conservative Party can't keep on electing and throwing out leaders. We've been chopping and changing leaders for the last 5 years. It didn't do very much good for us, and it creates more rancor. She's a brave lady, and I admire the campaigns against wokery, which she used to run when she was still a minister. That took quite a lot of chutzpah to do that, and I think she did it with great skill. And I think she is visibly growing into the job of leader of the opposition. We need to help her and encourage her as she does that. I think she is right to say that you can't write the 28-29 manifesto today. It'd be a crazy thing to do, and you don't want to lock yourself into pledges and promises that might look sensible today but might not be realistic then. But I think what she will do and is doing, what you have to do to be an effective opposition, is to say, you government are making this wrong choice today. We are not only opposing it today, but we're telling you what we would do today instead in order for the country to be better governed. That doesn't mean that we will do that in 4 years' time, because there'll be lots of other mistakes in 4 years' time, and we may have different priorities. I mean, an example, I think she and her team running a very good campaign against the IHT attack on small farms. And it's not a very large sum of money. Indeed, it might not produce very much money at all, but it's very easy, I think, for Conservatives to identify obvious waste in current budgets and say, well, we could easily cover that if we were governing today, because we wouldn't be doing all this carbon capture and storage, which you identified, or we would get further and faster with rescuing the lost productivity in the public services, which is now way over 20 billion loss. It's as big as the alleged black hole that Rachel Reeves has cooked up, but it's a real black hole that they could do something about if, for example, they just do what I've been proposing, which is put a staff freeze on to start running down the over-the-top costs of administration in many of these areas. So I think that's how you constructively oppose, and I think that's exactly what she and her team will do.
And what would your advice be to her vis-a-vis Farage and reform? Just sort of ignore them, get on with it, make your pitch, and hope
you've got to get on
back.
with it.
Yeah.
Don't attack Farage and reform. Understand that a lot of those people who voted for reform used to vote Conservative or might vote Conservative again. And they are the group who are particularly angry about the overall migration problem. And so getting the language right on migration and showing that the Conservative Party has learned, is beginning to learn in office and has now learned the hard way from the results of the election. And again, I think Kemi's been absolutely right on that. I mean, she's been bravely going on migration and taking counterattack from Starmer, who still thinks for some unknown reason he's on a winner on this, because he still doesn't seem to think he now owns the problem. But he's going to find he does own the problem, and I think she's been brave to do it, and that's part of the repositioning that she needs to undertake.
John, thank you so much. I'll end with well, it is actually a question, but it's more of a comment from Angela Hughes. I've always thought John would have made a fantastic PM. Why did he not stand for PM? Angela, he did in 1995. And just to show that John is always prescient, I think he ran on the slogan, no change, no chance. And he was right. There wasn't a change. And therefore, we didn't have a chance in 1997. We got obliterated a bit like we did in 2024. Before
I ran again in 97 for leader of the party.
Ran again in 97. There you go.
Two opportunities, and they decided I was not the right answer.
Yeah, that's the way the cookie crumbles and history goes sometimes. Before I thank Sir John, thanks to all of our audience for joining us. I've tried to get through a batch of your questions. Sorry, I couldn't get through all of them. I tried to take a fair chunk of them. Actually, the most upvoted one was Valerie saying, "Good evening, Mark. Good to see you." Well, good to see you too, Valerie. Thank you for everybody for voting that up. I wish you all a Merry Christmas if we don't meet before then. But just to remind you, and we'll put this in the chat box at the moment, we've got more upcoming Pop Conversations. On Tuesday, the 14th of January at 7 p.m, I'll be in conversation with Lord David Frost. And later on in January, more details will follow on that in the PopCon newsletter. I'll be in conversation with Ben Habib, the former deputy leader of Reform. And I should also say, I know many of you already are, but if you'd like to join the PopCon opinion panel, please do. Every 2 or 3 weeks, we send out a range of questions to seek your advice and guidance about where the country's going, where the centre-right's going, where conservatism is going, and where the party's going. And we feed that through to the media and to party high command, and I think we get a good hearing for it. So please join that panel. We'll also put the link in the chat. So thanks for all of you. Have a very great Christmas. But most of all, please join me in giving a big thumbs up and a salute to Sir John Redwood. John, it's always a pleasure to speak to you, to listen to you. Thanks for your wisdom, your guidance, your thinking. I hope it's taken on by the new leadership of the Conservative Party, as it seems to me that is the smartest, fastest route back to power and actually getting something conservative done in this country. On the downside, it looks like we're going to have 3 or 4 more years of this ghastly socialist government, but that at least gives us the time to reflect on what we want to do next and make sure if we are returned to office in 2029, God willing, that we get things right and hit the ground running. And you've given us a fantastic prospectus for how to approach that challenge and opportunity. So, John, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Great to speak to you. Well, that's all, ladies and gentlemen. Have a very Merry Christmas. Enjoy yourselves. Don't drink too much eggnog. Over and out.